So now that we've looked at some of the different ways that we can combine components together into blueprints, both class blueprints and level blueprints, let's look at a little bit more of an advanced example with this container crane. Now, I'll do a quick demo of what we're going to create here, what we're going over. This is essentially a large asset, once I click in the scene, that we've set up to respond to user input. So I can move this crane left and right, and I can even drop in specific components such as this clamp. To interact with other blueprints, such as the container on the back of this truck. And again, this is the same truck that we were using in the previous dynamic truck blueprint video. So now that I've picked up this container, I can move it, and I can even shift this over. And take a note of the different elements within this blueprint that are moving. So there's the crane overall that's moving left and right. Then there's the gantry that's moving forward and back. And then there's the clamp itself that is holding onto the container that's moving up and down. Let's look at some of the ways that we can work within the blueprint to enable this kind of functionality. We'll begin by clicking on this container and heading over to the World Outliner and jumping into the blueprint. Now, if I just zoom out, there's a lot that's going on that we'll cover later on about the movement. But for now, let's focus on some of the elements within it, as well as enabling input. So if you jump over to the Viewport tab, you can get a nice sense of the complete container crane. Now, if you head over to the Components section, you'll see that there's sort of a hierarchy of elements here. Essentially, this is how we're controlling and governing the movements of these different components. So the main static mesh is this overall container shape, and that's the parent for everything else. But then below that, we have the gantry that has the clamp as well as the cables connected below it. So anytime I move the gantry, these other elements will move with it. But then the clamp itself can move separate from the gantry up and down. So essentially, think of it like a parent and child relationship. This moves everything below it. This one moves everything below it. And then finally, we have this little tiny grab collider here, which is what we're going to use to actually pick up the container once we overlap it. So I'll just hit compile and head back over to the event graph. Now, before we can do any kind of movements, first we have to enable the input. So this is handled in a very simple way. Essentially, on event begin play, we just activate the enable input command. However, before we can do that, we have to drag off of this player controller and just type get player controller. And that'll just automatically ensure that you're using whichever player is running the scene at the time. It just makes sure that this is the player that enables input. Now, the next thing we want to do is set up commands to coordinate the button pressed on the keyboard with certain actions that we'll use to govern the movement of the crane. So how you can create these is, if you look, I have one that's just called up. If you right-click in the empty editor and type up, you'll see that there's a whole keyboard events section, and then the up command. So if you just drop this into the scene, it gives you a little pressed and released options, and we'll use that to essentially just set these simple Boolean commands to, when up is pressed, set is forward to true, and when it's released, set it to false. And that way we can just set up a script to just always listen for this Boolean command. And the moment that is forward is true, it will begin moving just that gantry forward along the crane. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And so you just set these for each direction that you want, up, down, left, right. And then in this case, I have space and left control to move the clamp up and down. And then in the next video, we'll talk about how we can rig all of those up to actually create movement.